The air backstage at Lakewood Church buzzed with an uneasy tension as the towering security guard's hand hovered just inches from Senator John Kennedy's shoulder. It was a moment teetering on the edge of something monumental, a spark that would ignite a revelation capable of shaking the foundations of modern Christianity and leaving 50,000 people grappling with the very essence of their beliefs. John Kennedy, the respected senator from Louisiana, stood encircled by Joel Osteen's private security team, his presence exuding a calm authority forged through years of public service. His eyes, sharp yet steady, carried the quiet strength of a man who had faced countless challenges in the Senate with unwavering principle. The head of security spoke, his voice low but edged with urgency. "Mr. Kennedy, Pastor Osteen has personally requested that you leave the premises immediately." But what unfolded next was not mere defiance or a show of bravado. It was a profound display of the senator's deep commitment to justice, a resolve that Joel Osteen, in all his years of preaching prosperity, had perhaps underestimated. The security team anticipated compliance, expecting Kennedy to slip away quietly, as others had when confronted by Lakewood's influence. They were entirely unprepared for the fact that John Kennedy had spent months meticulously preparing for this precise moment, not merely as a politician delivering a speech, but as a man driven by a moral imperative to confront what he saw as a misuse of faith. What Joel Osteen and his team could not have foreseen was that Kennedy had uncovered a truth so compelling it would lay bare the stark contrast between genuine service and practices that thrived on false promises, a truth obscured beneath layers of polished sermons and appeals for financial blessings, a truth that would challenge whether a public servant like Kennedy was there to offer platitudes or to stand as a protector of the vulnerable. John met the security guard's gaze, his voice resonating with the same conviction that had commanded respect in congressional hearings. "Tell Joel," he said, a faint smile, blending compassion with unyielding determination, "that I have a message for his people, and nothing is going to stop me from delivering it." What happened next would be captured on countless phones, shared millions of times, and force the Christian world to confront a piercing question. What if the promises of prosperity and blessing were crafted to enrich a few while leaving many in despair? If you're ready to uncover the truth. Joel Osteen tried to silence the difference between authentic faith and profitable faith. Hit that like button and drop a fire emoji in the comments. What you're about to witness will challenge everything you believe about modern Christianity and reveal how to discern leaders who serve from those who exploit. It all began with a phone call on a quiet morning, the kind of call that seemed routine but carried an undercurrent of something more significant. Joel Osteen's personal assistant, her voice infused with the warm, inviting charm Lakewood Church was renowned for, reached out to Senator John Kennedy with an offer framed as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. "Mr. Kennedy," she said, her tone practically radiant with enthusiasm, "Pastor Joel would be honored to have you share your insights at our upcoming service." Imagine the impact when a respected senator inspires 50,000 people with stories of how purpose and integrity bring abundant blessings. But John Kennedy was not a man easily swayed by flattery or grand gestures. His decades in public service had honed a keen sense of discernment, an ability to detect when an invitation carried hidden motives. As he listened to the assistant's carefully crafted words, a quiet unease stirred within him. The heavy emphasis on abundant blessings and financial favor struck a discordant note. It felt less like an invitation to share wisdom and more like a staged moment to bolster Lakewood's narrative of prosperity. Kennedy's instinct for truth, sharpened by years of navigating complex political landscapes, told him this was about more than a guest appearance. He agreed to speak, but not without a plan to dig deeper to uncover what lay beneath the surface of this seemingly generous offer. The weeks that followed saw Kennedy immerse himself in a research effort that would have unsettled even the most seasoned critics of prosperity theology. He delved into Joel Osteen's teachings, poring over sermons that promised wealth as a sign of divine favor, scrutinizing the ministry's public financial footprint, and most crucially, seeking out the stories of those who had followed Lakewood's promises to their detriment. What he uncovered was a troubling pattern of heartbreak families who had given their last dollars to the church, believing their sacrifices would yield miraculous returns only to face eviction and financial ruin. Elderly congregants who had donated their fixed incomes convinced that God would multiply their generosity, now struggling to afford basic necessities like food and medicine. But one story stopped him in his tracks, piercing his heart with its raw tragedy. Margaret Chen, an 82-year-old grandmother from Louisiana, a state Kennedy had sworn to serve with every fiber of his being. Margaret had sent her entire Social Security check to Lakewood for months on end, clinging to Osteen's assurances that her gifts would unlock God's financial floodgates. She died alone in a frigid apartment, her utilities cut off, because she had prioritized the church's appeals over her own survival. Her granddaughter's words, relayed in a handwritten letter, haunted Kennedy. "I thought God would take care of me if I took care of his preacher." The weight of those words settled over him like a heavy fog, each syllable a reminder of the human cost of unchecked promises. Reading Margaret's story, Kennedy felt a profound shift within him. This wasn't just a matter of theological differences or motivational rhetoric gone astray. It was about a system that seemed to prey on the most vulnerable, cloaking itself in the guise of spiritual authority. As a senator who had built his career on defending the people of Louisiana, Kennedy saw Margaret's story as more than a tragedy. It was a call to action, a summons to stand up for those who had been misled. If he truly embodied the values he championed, fairness, accountability, and protection for the powerless, he knew silence was not an option. The Jesus he had read about in Scripture, the one who condemned those who exploited the poor, who championed the marginalized and called out hypocrisy, would not have walked away from this moment. Neither could John Kennedy. Margaret's story wasn't just one woman's loss. It represented countless others who had been told their poverty was a sign of spiritual failure, their struggles a lack of divine favor. It was a betrayal of trust, and Kennedy, with his deep-rooted sense of justice, felt compelled to act. The night before his appearance at Lakewood, Kennedy sat alone in his hotel room, not rehearsing a speech, but engaging in a deep, introspective reflection on the responsibility he carried. This wasn't about political posturing or scoring points in a public arena. It was about standing up for people like Margaret Chen, whose faith had been weaponized against them. He thought about the countless others who had been taught to equate their worth with their wealth, their devotion with their donations. In the quiet of that moment, Kennedy asked himself a question that cut to the heart of his purpose. What would true integrity look like in a place that seemed to prioritize profit over people? He recalled the stories of those who had given everything only to be left with nothing but broken promises. He thought of the scriptures that spoke of justice, of caring for the widow and the orphan, of holding those in power accountable. As he rose from his reflection, Kennedy felt a clarity that transcended politics or public image. Tomorrow he wouldn't just be a guest speaker delivering prepared remarks. He would be a voice for those who had been silenced, a defender of truth in a space that might not welcome it. His preparation wasn't about crafting a polished presentation. It was about steeling himself for a moment that demanded courage, conviction, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right. The morning of the event arrived, and Kennedy stepped into Lakewood Church with a quiet determination. Backstage, the atmosphere was charged, the security team's presence, a subtle but unmistakable signal that his appearance was already causing ripples. As he waited, the head of security approached, flanked by two others, their faces set in professional resolve. "Mr. Kennedy," the lead guard said, his voice betraying a hint of discomfort. "There's been a change of plans. Pastor Joel has asked us to escort you out." But Kennedy, unfazed, reached into his jacket and pulled out a small piece of paper. The guards tensed, then relaxed when they saw it was merely a handwritten note. "Before I go," Kennedy said, his voice carrying the weight of years spent advocating for the voiceless, "I have a message from Margaret Chen's granddaughter." He unfolded the note and read aloud, his tone steady but filled with quiet power. "My grandmother died believing God had forsaken her because Pastor Joel suggested that hardship stems from lack of faith. She gave her utility money to his ministry and suffered in the cold. Please tell people the truth." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of a life lost and a trust betrayed. The guards, accustomed to handling disruptions, found themselves momentarily disarmed, staring into the eyes of a man whose calm resolve seemed to carry a moral authority they couldn't counter. Kennedy carefully folded the note and looked at each guard in turn. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice firm yet compassionate, "you can escort me out and I'll go peacefully. But Margaret Chen suffered because your boss teaches that struggles are personal failings. If you silence her story, you're part of the system that hurt her." The lead guard's radio crackled, Joel Osteen's voice cutting through, urgent and strained. "Get him out now before the service starts." But as the guards stepped closer, something remarkable happened. Kennedy smiled, not with defiance or anger, but with the same steady compassion he brought to his work in the Senate. "Tell Joel," he said, his voice now resonant, with an authority that seemed to echo beyond the room, "that Margaret Chen's story deserves to be heard, and nothing is going to prevent that." The guards hesitated, their resolve wavering in the face of a man who stood not for personal gain, but for the truth. What happened next would be captured on dozens of phones, shared millions of times, and prove that a senator known for his integrity could turn a moment of tension into a powerful opportunity for truth. Stay with me, because the moment John Kennedy stepped beyond that backstage barrier, he would set in motion a confrontation that would echo far beyond Lakewood's walls, challenging the very heart of what faith and leadership mean in a world swayed by promises of prosperity. The backstage of Lakewood Church was a labyrinth of sleek corridors and hushed voices, but for Senator John Kennedy, it felt like the calm before a storm he had been preparing to face for weeks. The air was charged with the weight of what was about to unfold, a moment that could redefine the intersection of faith and integrity for millions. Kennedy stood alone for a brief moment, his mind sharp and focused, his heart anchored by a resolve that had been forged not just in the Senate, but in the quiet moments of reflection that had led him to this point. He wasn't here to play a role or seek applause. He was here to speak for those like Margaret Chen, whose stories had been buried under the glitz of prosperity promises. The security team's attempt to remove him had failed not because of force, but because of the quiet power of truth, that Kennedy carried a power that made even seasoned guards hesitate. As he adjusted his jacket, the handwritten note from Margaret Chen's granddaughter, tucked safely inside Kennedy, felt the weight of the responsibility he had chosen to bear. This wasn't about politics or personal gain. It was about standing up for the vulnerable, for the people of Louisiana and beyond, who had been misled by teachings that equated faith with financial success. The senator's preparation had been meticulous, not just in gathering facts, but in grounding himself in the principles that had guided his career. Fairness, accountability, and a fierce commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. What happened next would test that preparation, as Kennedy faced not just Joel Osteen's security team, but the entire machinery of a ministry built on carefully curated promises. "Stay with me, Because when a man of principle steps into a space built on profit, the clash is nothing short of seismic. And what John Kennedy did in those critical moments would set the stage for a confrontation that would resonate far beyond Lakewood's walls. The preparation for this moment had begun weeks earlier, long before Kennedy set foot in Houston. After that unsettling phone call from Joel Osteen's assistant, with its polished invitation to share insights at Lakewood, Kennedy's instincts had kicked into high gear. He wasn't one to accept things at face value, not when the stakes involved the trust of thousands. The senator had spent his career asking hard questions, digging into the details others overlooked, and he approached this invitation with the same scrutiny. Late into the night in his office and hotel rooms, Kennedy pored over transcripts of Osteen's sermons, financial reports tied to Lakewood's operations, and most importantly, the testimonies of those who had followed the church's teachings. What he found wasn't just a pattern of optimistic rhetoric, it was a trail of shattered lives. Families who had emptied their savings accounts believing their donations would bring divine prosperity, only to lose their homes to foreclosure. Single mothers who had skipped meals to send money to Lakewood, hoping for a financial miracle that never came. Elderly congregants like Margaret Chen, who had given their last dollars in faith only to be left in poverty while the ministry thrived. Each story was a thread in a larger tapestry, one that painted a picture of a system that seemed to profit from the desperation of the faithful. Kennedy's research wasn't just academic, it was personal. As ascertainable data, Margaret Chen's story, however, remained the cornerstone of Kennedy's resolve. The 82-year-old Louisiana grandmother's tragedy, dying in a cold apartment after giving her Social Security checks to Lakewood, had struck a deep chord with him. Her granddaughter's letter, with its haunting words, "I thought God would take care of me if I took care of his preacher," was more than a story. It was a call to action. Kennedy saw in it a reflection of the countless others in his home state and beyond who had been led to believe that their struggles were a sign of spiritual failure. As he read through similar accounts, he uncovered more cases, veterans, retirees, struggling parents who had been convinced that faith meant financial sacrifice, only to face devastation when the promised blessings didn't materialize. These weren't abstract statistics. They were real people, many from communities Kennedy had sworn to serve. The senator's preparation wasn't just about gathering evidence. It was about understanding the human cost of prosperity theology. He turned to Scripture not as a prop, but as a guide, reflecting on passages that spoke of justice, humility, and care for the poor. The words of Jesus warning against those who devour widows' houses, and emphasizing that true treasure lies not in wealth, but in service resonated deeply. Kennedy wasn't preparing for a performance. He was steeling himself for a moral stand, one that would require the same courage he had shown in challenging powerful interests in Washington. The night before his appearance at Lakewood, Kennedy didn't rehearse a speech or polish talking points. Instead, he sat in quiet contemplation in his hotel room, the weight of Margaret Chen's note pressing on his heart. He thought about the responsibility of leadership, not just in politics, but in moments that demanded moral clarity. He reflected on the values that had shaped his career, standing up for the overlooked, holding the powerful accountable, and speaking truth, even when it was uncomfortable. This wasn't about scoring political points or gaining publicity. It was about giving voice to those who had been silenced by a system that seemed to exploit their faith. Kennedy asked himself a question that cut to the core. What does it mean to lead with integrity in a place that might prioritize profit over people? The answer lay in the stories of people like Margaret, in the scriptures that called for justice, and in his own commitment to serve the people of Louisiana. As he rose from that moment of reflection, Kennedy knew that the next day would demand more than words It would require action rooted in principle. He wasn't just going to Lakewood to speak. He was going to confront a narrative that had caused real harm, armed with nothing but truth and a resolve to make a difference. When the day arrived, Kennedy stepped into Lakewood Church with a quiet but unshakable determination. The atmosphere backstage was polished, but tense. The security team's presence a subtle reminder that his appearance was already causing unease. As he waited, the head of security approached, flanked by two others, their expressions professional but firm. "Mr. Kennedy," the lead guard said, his voice betraying a flicker of hesitation. "There's been a change of plans. Pastor Joel has asked us to escort you out." Kennedy, unfazed, reached into his jacket and pulled out the small piece of paper containing Margaret Chen's granddaughter's note. The guards tensed momentarily, then relaxed when they saw it was just a handwritten message. "Before I go," Kennedy said, his voice carrying the steady authority of a man who had faced down tough opponents in the Senate, "I have a message from Margaret Chen's granddaughter." He unfolded the note and read aloud, his tone deliberate and piercing. "My grandmother died, believing God had forsaken her, because Pastor Joel suggested that hardship stems from lack of faith. She gave her utility money to his ministry and suffered in the cold. Please, tell people the truth." The words landed like a thunderclap, the silence that followed heavy with the weight of a life lost and a trust betrayed. The guards, trained to handle disruptions, found themselves momentarily disoriented, facing a man whose calm resolve carried a moral force they couldn't easily dismiss. Kennedy folded the note carefully, his gaze moving from one guard to the next. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice firm, yet laced with compassion, "you can escort me out, and I'll go peacefully. But Margaret Chen suffered because your boss teaches that struggles are personal failings. If you silence her story, you're part of the system that hurt her." The lead guard's radio crackled, Joel Osteen's voice cutting through, urgent and strained. "Get him out now before the service starts." The guards stepped closer, their movements mechanical but hesitant, as if unsure how to proceed against a man whose presence commanded respect. Then something remarkable happened. Kennedy smiled, not with defiance or anger, but with the same steady compassion he had honed through years of advocating for the voiceless. "Tell Joel," he said, his voice now resonating with an authority that seemed to fill the room, "that Margaret Chen's story deserves to be heard, and nothing is going to stop that." The guards faltered, their resolve wavering in the face of a senator whose commitment to truth was palpable. They had expected resistance or argument, but not this, a man standing firm not for himself, but for those who had been wronged. In that moment, something shifted. The guards, trained to maintain order, found themselves unable to act decisively. Kennedy's words, grounded in the raw truth of Margaret Chen's story, had pierced the routine of their duties. The note in his hand wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a symbol of the countless lives affected by promises that didn't deliver. Kennedy's preparation had led him here, not to a stage for self-promotion, but to a crossroads where integrity demanded action. The security team's hesitation was a crack in the facade of Lakewood's carefully controlled environment, a sign that truth, when spoken with conviction, could unsettle even the most entrenched systems. What happened next would be captured on dozens of phones shared across the world, and prove that a senator known for his principles could transform a moment of tension into a powerful call for accountability. The confrontation was only beginning, but Kennedy's stand backstage had already set the tone. A man of integrity was about to step into the spotlight, not to shine for himself, but to illuminate the stories of those who had been left in the shadows. Stay with me, because when John Kennedy moved beyond that backstage barrier, he would carry Margaret Chen's story into a space unaccustomed to such truth, sparking a moment that would echo far beyond Lakewood's walls and challenge the very meaning of faith and leadership. The massive doors of Lakewood Church's sanctuary swung open with a resounding thud as Senator John Kennedy strode down the center aisle, his steps steady and purposeful, cutting through the hum of Joel Osteen's sermon, promising a life of abundance. The 50,000-strong congregation turned their murmurs swelling into a wave of curiosity as Osteen's voice faltered, his polished message of prosperity disrupted by the unexpected arrival. Kennedy's presence, radiating the calm authority of a seasoned public servant, filled the vast arena with an undeniable force. The security guards who had tried to stop him backstage had vanished, their resolve undone by a man armed with nothing but a handwritten note and a fierce commitment to truth. Joel Osteen's smile froze his eyes, fixed on Kennedy, who moved with the conviction of someone who had prepared for this moment with both intellect and heart. This wasn't a guest speaker playing a part. This was a senator from Louisiana, known for his integrity, stepping into a space built on promises that Kennedy believed had misled the vulnerable. The cameras broadcasting live to millions captured every second of what would become a pivotal moment in modern faith, a moment that would challenge the core of prosperity theology and demand a reckoning with reality. As Kennedy took the stage, the air grew heavy with anticipation, the congregation sensing that something profound was unfolding. Stay with me, because when a man of principle confronts a system built on profit, the impact is transformative. And what John Kennedy did next would spark a movement that would echo far beyond Lakewood's walls. Kennedy stepped to the center of the stage, his presence commanding silence without a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and resonant, carrying the weight of his Louisiana roots and years of advocating for justice. "My name is John Kennedy, and I'm here to share a message from someone who can no longer speak." The arena, typically alive with cheers, fell into a hush. Kennedy pulled the note from Margaret Chen's granddaughter from his jacket, holding it aloft for the cameras. "This is from the granddaughter of Margaret Chen, an 82-year-old woman from my home state of Louisiana," he said, his tone deliberate, each word piercing the polished atmosphere. "Margaret died alone in a cold apartment, her utilities cut off, because she gave her last dollars to this ministry, believing that faith would bring financial blessings. She trusted that her sacrifice would unlock divine favor, but instead, she suffered while this church thrived." The silence was profound, a stark departure from Lakewood's usual fervor. The congregation, accustomed to messages of hope and wealth, faced a story that cut through the glossy narrative. Kennedy's voice, steady, yet filled with compassion, made Margaret's loss undeniable, forcing the crowd to confront the human cost of the teachings they had embraced. Turning to Joel Osteen, who stood rigid behind his podium, Kennedy's gaze was unwavering. "Pastor Joel," he said, his voice blending empathy with resolute challenge, "Margaret Chen entrusted her faith to you, believing that poverty was a sign of spiritual failure. She gave everything, and it cost her life. How many others have suffered while being told their struggles stem from a lack of faith?" The question hung in the air, a direct challenge to Osteen and the prosperity gospel itself. The crowd stirred, some wiped tears. Others whispered urgently, a few stood as if wrestling with the weight of the moment. Kennedy opened a worn Bible, its pages marked from weeks of study. "Let me share something," he said, his voice clear and authoritative. "In Matthew 19, Jesus told a rich young man, 'Sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me.' The man left sad because he had great wealth." Kennedy paused, letting the words sink in. Then Jesus said, "It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone rich to enter the kingdom of God. Pastor Joel, when did you last preach that verse? The question landed like a thunderbolt. Joel Osteen, his face pale, gripped the podium, his usual confidence replaced by unease. "John, you're taking that out of context," he stammered, his voice thin. Kennedy, with the precision of a seasoned debater, responded calmly but firmly. "Let's add context, then," he said. "Jesus didn't promise wealth or ease. He said, 'In this world you will have trouble.' He called his followers to take up their cross, to give to the poor, to store treasures in heaven, not on earth. He warned against those who exploit the vulnerable for gain." The congregation was no longer quiet. The arena buzzed with emotion. Some wept openly, their faces reflecting the pain of a shattered narrative. Others called out, their voices a mix of confusion and anger. A few headed for the exits, their faith in Lakewood shaken. The cameras captured it all, broadcasting the unrest to millions as a senator known for integrity stood on Lakewood's stage holding a mirror to its practices. Then came a moment that stunned the arena. Members of Lakewood's worship team, poised to lead the next song, set down their instruments and stepped away. The lead singer, her voice trembling but resolute, grabbed the microphone. "We can't sing about a God who promises wealth when Jesus spoke of sacrifice," she said. "We're done." One by one, the team walked off their exit, a silent rebuke of the prosperity message. The congregation erupted, some in shock, others in tears, a few cheering as if recognizing the courage of the act. Kennedy stood firm, a beacon of calm amid the chaos. He held up Margaret Chen's note again. This woman believed her poverty meant God had abandoned her, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But the Jesus of Scripture was born in a stable, lived without a home, and died with nothing. He didn't measure faith by wealth. He measured it by love, by compassion, by how we treat the least among us. Margaret Chen's sacrifice showed more faith than many who profit from it. Joel Osteen, now visibly shaken, tried to regain control. "John, let's take this off stage," he said, his voice barely audible over the crowd's unrest. But Kennedy faced him squarely, his gaze piercing. "Pastor Joel," he said, his words carrying a lifetime of fighting for what's right. "This isn't about a private talk. This is about the people here, the people watching, who have been told their struggles are their fault, that their faith isn't enough because they're not rich. Margaret Chen's story represents countless others who trusted you and were left broken. The truth deserves to be heard now." The crowd's reaction was electric. Some stood and cheered, others knelt in prayer. A few canceled their recurring donations to Lakewood on their phones. The cameras zoomed in, capturing a congregation wrestling with a truth they had never confronted. Kennedy's words weren't an attack. They were a call to re-examine faith itself, grounded in Scripture, and the undeniable reality of lives like Margaret's. The senator's stand wasn't about tearing down one man, but about lifting up a message overshadowed by promises of wealth. The crowd's response, tears, questions, acts of spontaneous generosity signaled an irreversible shift. Some passed money to those seated near them, inspired by Kennedy's call to give to the poor. Others whispered prayers, their faces showing both sorrow and awakening. The worship team's exit had been a spark, but Kennedy's words were the flame igniting a movement that challenged Lakewood's core. Joel Osteen stood behind his podium, sweat on his brow, his empire trembling. The teleprompter scrolled, but he couldn't read it, his eyes fixed on Kennedy. The cameras caught his faltering composure as he called out, "Security, please restore order." But the words were lost in the crowd's response, a sea of individuals grappling with a choice: cling to comfortable promises or embrace the harder truth Kennedy had revealed. Kennedy stepped forward one last time. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "This is about Margaret Chen and countless others who gave everything and were left with nothing. This is about what faith really means, not wealth, but standing up for what's right." The stage was no longer Osteen's. It belonged to the truth Kennedy had brought, and the cracks in prosperity theology were spreading. Stay with me, because Kennedy's mission wasn't just to challenge one church. It was to anchor a vision of faith rooted in truth, forcing millions to choose between easy promises and authentic conviction.